Tonight's story appears in Haunted Voices, which is a collection of Scottish Gothic writing which was published last year by Haunt Publishing. It's a really diverse collection of stories and writers, and one of the best things about it was that it also released as an audiobook with all the individual writers getting to tell their tales in a kind of grand tradition of storytelling. And I'm trying to capture that this week myself for Inverclyde's Galoshans Festival by sharing a ghost story every evening this week at 8 o'clock. And so this was my story for Haunted Voices. The Leerie. I don't sleep well. That's the truth of it. I never have. I don't like the dark. I was 10 years old when I finally came to understand why. And nothing has changed my mind since. I turned 10 in 1950, and at this point, my exasperated mother decided she could take no more. A big boy of 10 needs to stop worrying about the dark, she kept saying, as if simply saying it would make it so. As if the words would shine bright enough to keep my troubles away. We were walking home from school having another of these discussions when my mother saw a new way to try and convince me I was being silly. Look, here's Mr. Monroe. He knows all about the dark. Mr. Monroe was a Leerie, one of the few lamplighters left in the town. He was an older man, tall and thin like a gas lamp post himself, with a neat grey beard that did not hide his smile. My mother knew I liked Mr. Monroe. He always waved when he lit the lamp right outside my bedroom window. She invited him to talk some sense into me. Mr. Monroe, is there any reason you know of to be afraid of the dark? Mr. Monroe frowned at me, clearly understanding his role in this conversation. Not at all. If it wasn't for the dark, I'd not have a job. I make sure there's plenty of light to be had all over the town, and with all these new lamps coming in soon, well, there won't be a spot of darkness left. Mr. Monroe patted me on the head, and he and my mother exchanged some gossip about the milkman, a gentleman Mr. Monroe was not especially fond of. I stared at his ladder and the pole he used to light the gas lamps. There was no reason to be afraid of the dark. Why did we need lamplighters? That same night, I woke abruptly into darkness. The lamp outside my window had gone out, and the dark had woken me. I scrambled to the window, hoping I would find light elsewhere on the street. All of the lamps were out. I stared over the narrow, close gap between the two opposite tenements. There was another gas lamp which stood right there. Beneath the lamp, standing still, was Mr. Monroe. He was making no effort to light that lamp, any of the others. Instead, he was staring off down the street towards town. At first, I supposed that Mr. Monroe must be performing some maintenance of the lamps. But then I realised that he would surely have done that during the day. I waved to try and get his attention, thinking that I would ask him to light my lamp. If he saw me, he gave no sign and instead kept watching down the street. I now guessed he must be waiting for a friend or a fellow lamplighter. I was mistaken. Mr. Monroe seemed to stiffen slightly, pushing himself against the tenement wall. He then bowed his head as if he were at church, and as he did, a shadow passed across the road. I could not make it out properly as the light was so low, but gradually I could see that it was a man, limping slowly across the cobbles, balancing himself on his cane. Mr. Monroe knew him. He gave no sign, keeping his head bowed the whole time. The man continued slowly past the lamplighter into the darkness of the gap between the two buildings. As soon as he'd passed, Mr. Monroe turned his collar up against the cold, gathered the tools of his trade and walked swiftly off down the street. It was over an hour before the street lamp outside my room was lit again, and all that time I lay thinking about the limping man, and how his cane had made no noise upon the cobbles as he walked. The next morning, I resolved to investigate the close across the street. I'd run in and out of all the tenements and closes in our street, but when I tried to remember this one, I couldn't. Some closes backed onto others, providing shortcuts through the back streets. Others opened out into courtyards and drying greens. I was surprised and disappointed to find that this one was a dead end, really nothing more than a gap between the buildings. I was not the only person in the close though. Mr. Monroe was there too, brushing up the cobbles. "Are you looking for your friend?" I asked Mr. Monroe. He turned with a start and then smiled when he saw that it was me. "Oh, it won't do to stay down here too long. Not much light, so it gets cold quickly in the winter. You'll catch a chill." He put his arm on my shoulder and led me back out onto the street. "How are you getting along at night time?" he asked. "Oh, very well," I said, slightly embarrassed. Would you like to know how I came to be a Leerie?" I nodded. My father was a lamplighter. I remember every now and then he would come home with these beautiful insects, moths, butterflies, all sorts. These creatures would find their way over in all the strange cargoes and crates that would turn up at the docks. "Our docks?" Mr. Monroe nodded. "Poor things would flit and flutter about the streets, not used to the dark and the cold, and as soon as the lamps were lit, there they would be, pushing against the glass to get to the light and the warmth. Most of them wouldn't last too long, and my father would scoop them up and sell them on to the museum or collectors. I thought they looked so beautiful." "You wanted to see the insects?" "Maybe," said Mr. Monroe. "Don't see so many now, there's not as many ships coming in." "Perhaps I could be a lamplighter," I said, not really sure if I meant it or not. Mr. Monroe smiled. "Not long left for gas lamps. It's all going electric. No need for the likes of me. It'll be all clean light and wires, crackling and sparking all the time." Mr. Monroe made sure that I was home safely, and then I watched from my window as he walked back down into the close across the street. That night I waited, and again the lamplighter stood in the shadows, head bowed. It was not long until another figure approached. This time the person hopped and bounced, and I could see that it was a boy, a little younger than myself. He seemed to know Mr. Monroe and stood by him as if trying to engage him in a game. But the lamplighter barely acknowledged him, but for one gesture, which was to point down into the close. Mr. Monroe was well known as a kind man, and he was especially good-natured with children, so this strange behaviour unsettled and upset me. Mr. Monroe pointed one final time towards the close, then gathered his tools and walked off down the street. I watched as the boy stood, unsure, deciding what to do. After a moment, he turned and walked into the close. At that moment, I resolved to do what the lamplighter should have done and provide shelter and companionship to the lost boy. I slipped out of my house as quietly as I could and ran down the stairs of our cold tenement and out, across the street, into the close. The boy was standing at the far corner where the tenement walls met. There was a glow there, which I took to be embers from a dying fire. He had his back to me, so not wishing to startle him, I called out to him in a whisper. At first, it seemed that he had not heard me, and I was about to call out again. And then he turned. His motion was now slow and awkward, like a rusted wheel grinding as it turns. As he finally faced me, I saw that I had made a terrible mistake. 2 empty black eyes stared out from the boy's pale face, and his skin and features had slipped like melted candle wax. As he saw me, his misshapen mouth opened in a hideous silent scream, and arms now outstretched, he ran towards me at great speed. I turned to flee and ran straight into Mr. Munro. I panicked, turning back again to look at the boy, who was now standing still once more. Mr. Munro patted my shoulders and gestured that I should stand behind him. He did not say a word, but instead pointed towards the corner. The boy took a tiny step towards him, but the lamplighter shook his head and kept pointing. Slowly, sadly, the boy turned and walked back towards the corner. Mr. Munro turned now too and gently pushed me back along the close. A bright light now shone behind us, growing brighter with every step back towards the street, and then it stopped, and the close and the street were once again in darkness. "What was that?" I asked. "Not for us to see," said Mr. Munro. "That's an end of it." "But the boy?" Mr. Munro nodded. "Lots of reasons people don't like the night time, but some people are scared because they see what hides there." He looked at me, smiling sadly. "Is that not right?" I thought of the grey faces I would see reflected in windows, of the figures who'd stand behind me in mirrors, and of their always outstretched hands, thin and grasping. "You see them too. Who are they?" "People. Just people. Poor things. Lost in the cold, trying to stay where it's warm. And it's cruel to keep them here, circling around that light. It's better to help them pass on into the dark. Down that close. That close, the old railway by the berry yards, an old tunnel beneath the docks. There's always roads that seem to take you one way, but lead you another." "But not for the likes of us to understand," said Mr. Munro. "I just light the lamps. And switch them off too, when that's what needed. If I were you, I'd make your peace with the dark, and all that's in it." The lamplighter walked me back to my front door, and was kind enough never to tell my mother about my misadventures. After that, the lights on our street were kept on. Mr. Munro guided his moths elsewhere. I think about him often, about his unquestioning sense of responsibility to something he couldn't understand or explain. Over the next few years, the new electric lights flickered on all across the town. On Clarence Street, down Pottery Street, along the Esplanade, even up Pete Road, the darkest stretch in the whole town, there was light. Light such as never before. Mr. Munro himself passed on not so long after. It was a cleaner light, colder, but bright enough to make the streets seem safer than they'd ever been. So it seemed to everyone else. But I see them all, trapped and flickering, throwing themselves endlessly towards our new light and smashing up against it. There are not enough shadows to fall into, not enough old ways to wander into the dark. Some seem to know that I see them and they follow me, waiting for me, to reach out, to help, or to walk with them into the darkness. That same darkness I've run from my whole life. There's no rest. Those faces that once moved only amongst the nighttime shadows now stare at me every hour of the day, as if pleading with me to gather them up into the warmth of the living, or to usher them forever into the dark. But I am no lamplighter.